There comes a moment when you understand something unsettling. Failure is no longer what frightens you. You have lived with it. You have adapted to it. You know how to survive disappointment, mediocrity, and regret. What truly unsettles you is something else. The quiet realization that if you stopped hiding, if you stopped delaying, if you stopped numbing yourself, you might actually become what you are capable of becoming. And that possibility feels heavier than defeat. Failure has a shape you recognize. It is familiar. It excuses you. It explains why you stayed small. But potential has no such mercy. Potential demands responsibility. It demands action. It demands that you stop pretending you are limited by circumstances when deep down you know you are limited by avoidance. That is why potential feels dangerous. It strips away your justifications. You tell yourself you fear disappointment, but that is not true. You fear clarity. Because clarity would mean there is no one left to blame. Not the economy, not your past, not your parents, not the timing. If you acted with full intention and still failed, you could accept that. What you cannot accept is discovering that you never truly tried. This is the silent conflict many men carry. On the surface, they speak of patience, realism, or caution. Underneath, there is hesitation. A hesitation rooted not in weakness, but in the awareness of strength. You sense that if you commit fully, your life will no longer tolerate excuses. The moment you step into your capacity, every wasted hour will become visible. Every distraction will feel like betrayal, and that is uncomfortable. So you delay. You prepare endlessly. You research. You wait for certainty. You tell yourself you are being disciplined, when in truth you are being careful not to awaken a force inside you that will demand consistency. Potential is not gentle. Once acknowledged, it expects alignment. And alignment requires sacrifice. Stoic thought does not comfort this fear. It confronts it. It does not ask whether you feel ready. It asks whether you are acting according to what is within your control. And the uncomfortable truth is this: your effort is within your control. Your attention is within your control. Your daily conduct is within your control. When you realize this, the weight shifts. You can no longer hide behind chance. There is a particular moment when this awareness becomes sharp. It happens in silence, often at night, when there is no audience, no noise, no distraction. You reflect on what you could have done today and did not because you were incapable, but because you chose ease. That moment is not dramatic, but it is honest, and honesty is threatening to a man who has learned to survive by lowering his expectations of himself. Potential forces you to confront a deeper fear. The fear of becoming accountable to your own standards. As long as you remain uncommitted, your self-image stays flexible. You can still believe you would have succeeded if circumstances were different. But the moment you act fully, that illusion collapses. You will see yourself clearly, and clarity is unforgiving. This is why some men unconsciously sabotage momentum. When things begin to align, they hesitate. When discipline starts forming, they interrupt it. When progress becomes visible, they retreat. Not because they are incapable, but because success removes the comfort of ambiguity. It replaces it with obligation. The Stoics understood this well. They observed that men suffer more from imagined futures than from real events. Potential is an imagined future loaded with expectation. It forces you to confront the question, what kind of man will you be if you stop hiding? And more importantly, will you accept the daily burden that comes with that answer? You may think you want transformation, but transformation is not an emotion. It is a restructuring of habits, priorities, and identity. It is waking up without negotiating with yourself. It is choosing restraint when indulgence is available. It is doing what needs to be done even when no one is watching. That is not inspiring, it is demanding. Failure, by contrast, is passive. It requires no discipline. It arrives naturally when you do nothing. That is why it feels safer. You do not have to change who you are to fail. You only have to remain who you are. Potential asks for something else. It asks you to become deliberate. There is also the fear of isolation. When you step into your capacity, your environment often resists, not out of malice, but out of discomfort. Your growth becomes a mirror, and not everyone wants to look. Remaining below your potential keeps relationships stable. Stepping into it introduces friction. And most men, unconsciously, value belonging over self-respect. But Stoic clarity demands that you ask a harder question. Is a life of quiet compromise worth the approval of those who benefit from your restraint? If your potential scares you, it is often because it threatens the structure of your current life. It will demand changes. In how you spend your time, in what you tolerate, in who you listen to. That disruption feels like loss, even when it is necessary. There is no reassurance here, only truth. You will not feel ready before acting. Readiness is not a prerequisite, it is a byproduct. Discipline precedes confidence, action precedes clarity. The Stoic does not wait for inner alignment before moving. He moves, and alignment follows. You may notice resistance rising as you hear this, a tightening, a desire to postpone reflection. That is not weakness, it is recognition. Something in you understands that comfort is being challenged, and comfort once questioned rarely survives. This is the first threshold, not between failure and success, but between avoidance and responsibility. You do not cross it by force, you cross it by decision. A quiet one, repeated daily, without ceremony, without announcement, simply choosing not to betray your capacity today. Your potential does not need to be fully understood. It only needs to be respected, and respect begins with small, deliberate actions, aligned with what you know is required. Nothing grand, nothing performative, just honest effort. If this realization unsettles you, let it. Discomfort is not an enemy. It is a signal, a sign that you are close to something real. The Stoic does not flee that signal. He observes it, he allows it, and then he acts anyway. Remain here, with the tension. Do not resolve it. Do not escape it. Learn to stand in it without collapsing. Because the man who can sit calmly with the weight of his own potential is already stronger than the one who runs from it. You begin to notice something subtle once you stop running from your potential. The fear does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, more internal, less dramatic. It no longer screams, it watches, and that is more dangerous, because a fear that observes can influence decisions without announcing itself. At this stage, most men do not collapse, they drift. They remain functional, they work, they socialize, they maintain appearances, but something is off. Their actions no longer match their awareness. They know what should be done, yet they hesitate to do it fully. Not out of laziness, but out of internal conflict. They are standing between who they have been and who they could become, and that space feels unstable. This instability creates friction inside the mind. You feel it when you're alone with your thoughts. A low-grade tension, a sense of delay. You are not at peace, but you are not in crisis either. That in-between state is dangerous because it can last for years. It is comfortable enough to survive, but uncomfortable enough to quietly erode self-respect. The Stoics understood that internal conflict is not resolved by thought alone. Reflection without action sharpens awareness, but weakens resolve. You become more conscious, but not more capable. This is why some men become intellectually disciplined, but practically stagnant. They know the principles, they understand the ideas, yet their lives remain unchanged. Knowledge becomes another refuge. There is a particular temptation here. You begin to refine your standards internally without enforcing them externally. You imagine the man you should be. You critique yourself mentally. You rehearse future discipline. And because this process feels serious, it creates the illusion of progress. But nothing tangible changes. And over time, that gap between awareness and action becomes a source of quiet shame. That shame does not explode. It dulls. It numbs. You begin to avoid situations that would test you. You choose environments where little is demanded. You gravitate toward conversations that stay superficial. You protect your potential by never placing it under strain. This is not cowardice. It is misdirected preservation. Potential feels fragile when untested. You fear that if you apply pressure, it may break, so you keep it theoretical, untouched, untarnished. But this is a misunderstanding. Potential is not something to be preserved. It is something to be converted. And conversion requires friction. The Stoic approach is not to eliminate fear, but to reduce its authority. Fear is allowed to exist, but it is not allowed to decide. You act according to reason, not comfort. And reason tells you something simple. What is untrained will decay. What is avoided will weaken. What is delayed will not remain neutral. It will turn against you. There is also the fear of identity loss. When you step into your capacity, you shed certain narratives. You can no longer claim to be unlucky. You can no longer indulge in self-pity without contradiction. You can no longer speak casually about discipline while avoiding it privately. Growth removes convenient stories, and many men are more attached to their stories than to their future. You may notice resistance when your routines begin to solidify, when days become structured, when excuses no longer fit. That resistance often appears as restlessness. You suddenly feel bored, irritated, drawn to distractions you had previously outgrown. This is not random. It is the mind attempting to restore a familiar identity. The Stoics would not interpret this as failure. They would see it as adjustment. The psyche resists change even when change is necessary. The discipline is not to fight the resistance emotionally, but to continue acting despite it, to let the resistance exhaust itself while you remain steady. At this point, another fear emerges, the fear of endurance. It is one thing to act once, it is another to act consistently. Potential, once activated, does not ask for intensity. It asks for persistence. And persistence is where most men retreat, because persistence means there is no finish line to hide behind, no dramatic climax. Just repetition. Repetition strips life of drama, and drama is comforting. Drama makes suffering feel meaningful without requiring discipline. Consistency, by contrast, is quiet, invisible, unrewarded in the short term. It asks you to show up when motivation is absent. That is why it is so effective, and why it is so resisted. You may find yourself craving validation once you begin to act seriously. A desire to be seen, to be acknowledged. This is natural, but it is also a test. The Stoic path is not antisocial, but it is internally anchored. Your sense of progress cannot depend on applause, because applause is unreliable, and dependence on it creates fragility. There is a deeper fear beneath all of this. The fear that if you fully commit and remain consistent, you will discover that the life you imagined is not as fulfilling as expected, that your sacrifices will not lead to external recognition, that your discipline will be invisible. This fear is rarely admitted, but it is real. Stoic clarity reframes this entirely. The purpose of discipline is not reward, it is alignment. To live in accordance with reason, to reduce internal conflict, to respect your own capacity. Fulfillment is not something added later. It is something felt immediately when action and values align. When you act in accordance with what you know is right, tension decreases, even when outcomes are uncertain, even when progress is slow. This is not emotional relief. It is structural stability. Your life begins to make sense from the inside out. But reaching this state requires one uncomfortable acceptance. You must accept that no one is coming to authorize your transformation. There will be no moment of permission, no external confirmation that you are ready. Readiness is assumed by action, not granted by circumstance. You may still feel fear. That is irrelevant. Fear does not disqualify you. Avoidance does. The Stoic does not measure himself by emotional comfort, but by conduct, by what he does when his mind offers resistance. If you are unsettled by this stage, that is expected. You are no longer asleep, but not yet fully disciplined. You are aware enough to feel tension, but not yet stable enough to feel calm. This is not a problem. It is a passage. Do not rush to resolve it. Do not dramatize it. Continue acting with restraint, intention, and consistency. Let your nervous system adjust. Let your identity recalibrate. Over time, the fear of potential weakens, not because it disappears, but because you prove to yourself that you can carry it without breaking. Stay with that. Do not seek relief. Seek steadiness. Eventually, something stabilizes. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It happens quietly, almost without permission. You notice that the fear which once dominated your thoughts no longer controls your behavior. It still exists, but it no longer dictates. You act, and the fear follows instead of leading. This is not courage as emotion, it is courage as posture. At this stage, you understand something fundamental. Your potential was never the threat. Your imagination of it was. You projected weight, expectation, and consequence far beyond what reality demanded. In truth, potential does not arrive all at once. It reveals itself in fragments, through ordinary days, through small decisions made consistently. The fear came from treating it as a verdict instead of a process. The Stoic perspective clarifies this sharply. You were never asked to become everything at once. You were asked to act according to reason in the present moment, to do what is within your control now. Potential is not a destination you reach, it is a direction you align with. And alignment does not overwhelm, it steadies. You begin to feel this steadiness in subtle ways. You wake without negotiating with yourself. You act without rehearsing outcomes. You choose restraint without resentment. Your mind becomes less noisy, not because life is easier, but because your actions are no longer in conflict with your values. Internal resistance decreases when behavior is consistent. This is where many misunderstand Stoic discipline. They assume it is about suppression, about forcing yourself through discomfort. That is only the beginning. True discipline simplifies. It removes unnecessary friction. When your conduct matches your principles, there is less internal debate, less exhaustion. You conserve energy because you are no longer arguing with yourself. You also notice a change in how you perceive failure. It loses its emotional charge. Failure becomes information, not identity. When something does not work, you adjust without collapsing. Because your sense of worth is no longer tied to outcomes, but to effort and intention. This is not detachment from life. It is engagement without fragility. Your relationship with time shifts as well. You stop rushing toward imagined futures. You stop measuring yourself against abstract milestones. You focus on today's actions. This creates patience, not passive waiting, but active endurance. You understand that progress accumulates quietly and that impatience is often disguised anxiety. At this point, you may notice something unexpected. The external world responds differently, not because you demand recognition, but because your presence changes. You speak less, you explain less, you do not need to convince. Your consistency communicates what words cannot. This is not dominance, it is coherence. People sense when a man is internally aligned. But Stoic wisdom cautions you here. External response is incidental. It is not the measure. The measure is internal order, a life that makes sense to the one living it. You resist the temptation to seek validation, because validation reintroduces dependence, and dependence erodes steadiness. You also accept something difficult. Potential fulfilled does not guarantee happiness. It guarantees responsibility, a deeper one. You no longer live on borrowed excuses. Your choices carry weight. But this weight is no longer frightening, it is grounding, it anchors you. You know where you stand because you placed yourself there deliberately. This acceptance marks a turning point. You stop asking whether you are capable. You start asking whether you are willing to maintain standards without applause, willing to endure monotony, willing to choose long-term integrity over short-term comfort. These are not dramatic questions. They are practical, and they are answered daily. There is also a quiet grief that may surface, grief for time wasted, for years spent avoiding yourself. The Stoics would not encourage dwelling here. Regret is only useful if it sharpens judgment, not if it weakens resolve. You acknowledge it, you learn from it. Then you return to action. The present is the only domain where correction is possible. As this pattern continues, fear becomes less personal. You no longer interpret it as a sign of inadequacy. It becomes a biological signal, nothing more. Your nervous system learned to associate growth with threat. You retrain it through exposure and consistency. Calm is not achieved by thinking differently, but by behaving differently over time. This is the deeper transformation, not becoming fearless, but becoming reliable to yourself. You do what you say you will do. You honor your commitments, especially the private ones. This builds trust internally, and internal trust is the foundation of self-mastery. You may realize now that the question was never whether your potential was too great. The question was whether you were prepared to live without excuses, to face yourself daily without distortion, to accept both your limitations and your capacity without dramatization. This balance is rare, and it is earned. Stoic discipline does not promise ease. It promises clarity. And clarity, once achieved, simplifies life. You waste less time. You tolerate less nonsense. You invest energy where it matters. This is not rigidity, it is precision. Your life may still be difficult. Circumstances may remain uncertain. Outcomes may vary. None of that invalidates the work, because the work was never about control over results. It was about control over response, over effort, over character. When you realize this fully, something settles permanently. You stop fearing who you could become, because you understand that becoming is not a leap. It is a sequence, and each step is manageable when taken alone. This is not the end of struggle, but it is the end of avoidance. You no longer need to run from your potential. You carry it with you, quietly, responsibly, without spectacle, and that is enough.